For the first time in my channel's history, I'm not going to be talking about any specific game, movie, album, or anything like that. Not a review, not an analysis on game design or game mechanics, and if you saw my last video on Silent Hill F, believe it or not, I'm not going to be talking about fixing puzzle box design that used to be much more prominent in the genre. Today, I'm actually presenting an argument with a potential solution to something that has always bothered me in survival horror, and that is death. Death as a concept isn't unique to just the survival horror genre, or horror games in general, but video games as a medium. Video games utilize death, or I guess if you wanted to, I could be more broad and just simply use the term failure state. And what I mean by that is simply a point in the gameplay experience where the player loses against the game. The player character loses all of their health pool, or a certain event is triggered that breaks from the intended narrative or the intended flow of the game, resulting in a game over screen. Just about every single video game uses a failure state, from Silent Hill F to Disco Elysium to Tetris. But what makes horror games in this regard so unique? It's pretty simple. I almost hate rambling about how good survival horror as a genre is, but I'm going to do it again here because the situation calls for it. In this regard, survival horror uses the threat of death and the threat of lost progress as its main mechanical incentive for horror. The classic Resident Evil games, for example, used ink ribbons as a way to make the player constantly on edge by making saving the game itself a resource that they had to keep track of. The simple fact that at some point while playing Resident Evil, you will most likely ask yourself if it's worth saving the game at all, potentially holding out for a later save point to spare your precious ink ribbons. And that is brilliant, because it makes that potential death that much more threatening and inevitably more scary when you encounter an enemy, given the fact that if you choose not to save and decide to continue on and then you die before you reach a next save point, you're gonna lose all that progress. For years, ink ribbon or not, this is what horror games have relied upon, and what, at least in my opinion, is what makes death in horror games scary, or at least what helps give the games their tension. Now, as a contrast, horror and comedy both pose a similar problem when it comes to criticism towards them, which is the difficulty of actually critiquing what doesn't really work about their respective goals. As an example, a lot of reviews towards comedy will often default to saying that the movie just wasn't funny, and while horror movies aren't quite as obtuse when it comes to legitimate criticism, a lot of bad horror movies are often bad due to the fact that a lot of them just aren't scary. And to compound that issue even further, horror, not at all unlike comedy, is best when first experienced, and sort of loses its muster or its punch after repeated viewings. How many times can you sit through the same joke over and over again, back to back, before you start losing the punch of the punchline? How many times can you hear Jonah Hill say,
"Why the fuck would it be between that or Muhammad?"
essentially on repeat before you stop laughing or even smiling? I'd say not many. And honestly, that number is still likely higher than the number of times that anyone would get jump scared by the body in the locker gag from the original Silent Hill. It's a brilliant moment, hearing the slamming of the locker door only to be jump scared by a harmless little cat, and then later hearing that same sound, opening the same locker, and finding nothing but a pool of blood with nothing else as you turn around and leave the room in such... This gag is not only one of the all-time greats of horror games, but in my opinion, literally all of horror as a medium. It's paid off with excellent suspense and perfect timing, but I would still argue that at most, the average person would get scared by it in their entire lifetime twice. After that, whether you realize it or not, you likely will have a subconscious understanding of not only what the gag is, but the timing of it. You will likely never get scared by that locker in your entire life again. And this is all to say that the titular survival horror problem is simply, how do you make death actually matter in a horror game? Horror in horror games are presented in many ways, but I think that generally a lot of the ways that horror games present their horror, or at the very least enforce it, is through the threat of death, as I've gone over. Sure, you might have a big spooky monster chasing you, and that is scary, I guess. But when you're playing a game in your chair with a controller in your hand and you know that the only thing actually chasing you in real life is the IRS, then that monster on the screen on its own isn't very scary. But what makes that monster scary, at least a little bit, is that little monster in that little screen is gonna kill your little character. And what makes that scary is the aforementioned lost progress. How often have you been playing a game like Resident Evil and have only felt the gripping sense of panic take hold when you realized that the last save point that you had was maybe like an hour or more in the past? All that lost progress, mechanically, is the reason that dying in a horror game really feels as scary as it does. Sure, the game might make the moment of dying scary, such as any interaction with Jack Baker from Resident Evil 7, for instance, but after a certain point, even he will become a system that you can read and you can exploit, dwindling his fear factor to a number on a spreadsheet. So what's my issue with death in horror games as they are right now? Dying means that the players have to replay parts of a horror game, which inherently make the horror less effective. The cleanest example of this issue that I can think of is from Silent Hill 3. In the latter half of the game, you come across a haunted house with a save point right outside of its front door. Once you step inside, you are confronted with several rooms that are very much akin to the Haunted Mansion from Disneyland, but much less extravagant. And they're all paired with the spooky voice that explains each room and the lore that each room of the house holds. The Haunted House segment is easily one of the most famous sections from one of the most famous games in one of the most famous franchises in all of horror. So I think that it goes without saying that it's fantastic. It's got plenty of eerie moments, coupled with the wonderfully childlike sense of horror that contrasts really well with the rest of the game outside that house, and then is capped off with another excellent jump scare. But what comes right after that is not another save point, but instead a long hallway with a big ball of light that will instantly kill you. What makes this worse is that that long hallway is a very tight and claustrophobically framed maze, which makes it not that hard for the light to catch up with you, and if it does, it will set you back to that front door, forcing you to do the entire haunted house all over again. Not only does that suck, it flat out ruins what would otherwise be arguably the most memorable part of the entire game and potentially turn it into a frustrating and tedious segment if you ponder the orb. Generally speaking now, in the worst case scenario, in an effort to prevent having to replay sections of a game over and over again, players will start to min-max before they've even beaten it, which in a horror game scenario doesn't even make it a horror game anymore, but simply a mechanically restrictive experience. Do you think Markiplier was afraid of Five Nights at Freddy's by the time that he got around to the 20-20-20-20 mode? Fuck no! Motherfucker was a machine-performing psychoanalytical theoretical physicist by that point. So what's the solution? This is such a me thing to propose. You use the soul tendency system from Demon Souls. No, I know that I'm constantly referencing Souls-likes and how great they are, but I'm being sincere when I say this. Use the soul tendency system from Demon Souls in horror games. Now, if you're not aware, the soul tendency system from Demon Souls was a mechanic that, as far as I'm aware, was never reutilized anywhere in the From Software catalog, and in my opinion, is the single coolest mechanical flair that the studio ever utilized, apart from maybe the bonfire aesthetic from Dark Souls 2. The soul tendency system at its core was a system that both rewarded and punished players for failing. It would simultaneously open and close certain paths from being accessed. It made item drops better if you were in a more negative roll tendency, but enemies in turn would be stronger and you would deal less damage overall, but simultaneously would be reversed if you were making progress throughout a level and would essentially max out on the other side of the spectrum if you had beaten all of the bosses in a certain area of the game. There is slightly more to it than that, but that is the core of the system that you need to understand in order to understand my argument. The soul tendency system, if utilized properly in a survival horror game, would, in my opinion, fix this issue that I have with the horror genre potentially entirely. Imagine a new IP horror game that leaned heavily into psychological horror akin to Silent Hill, and every time you died, there would be the threat of a new scare, or a new enemy that would appear that you weren't prepared for this time around. Less ammo, new unlocked pathways, and maybe even pathways being blocked off entirely due to your incompetence, or even better still, the threat of nothing happening at all. On the flip side, if you manage to perform well enough that the soul tendency system leans towards the more positive side, then all of a sudden, the enemies that you encounter in the game are significantly harder to take down. You might stumble across less ammo. You might even get new, specific encounters that a player with lower soul tendency wouldn't face. And all of this inherently gives the game a more scary edge with that original threat of death, but now compounded with the added feature of the world tendency reacting accordingly with more negative consequences in the entire game, and in turn, potentially more new and varied scares. Now, another way to think about what I'm saying is, if you look back at classic survival horror games, I and a lot of other people have always appreciated the genre for its relatively common use of randomizing some of its puzzles. Not to always default to Silent Hill, but a lot of the codes that you need to input in Silent Hill 2, for instance, such as the turn the numbers puzzle, are always randomized, albeit from a set number of variables. Why not take that same mentality of design and put it in the forefront of the entire gameplay experience, making each moment of the game potentially have some unobtrusive variable that would only add suspense to the gameplay experience? Not only would this open the floodgates of potential design space, but it would single-handedly make every single potential death a threat to the player beyond just any lost progress. It would instill a fear of the unknown into the player because they wouldn't know what will be waiting for them this time around after they die. It would make death rewarding, whether it's beneficial or not to the player, and in my opinion, it would make the game inherently more interesting. In fact, this system, if utilized in the way that I'm imagining it, is really just an updated and tweaked version of the sanity system from Eternal Darkness, where if your character suffered enough turmoil in their adventure, they would start to actually lose their mind, and the game itself would start fucking with you, such as making you think the game's save system was corrupt, turning the screen off, having your character's limbs start falling off, and many other manners of mind fuckery. To my recollection, none of Eternal Darkness's sanity system was really built around or exploited death, and I think that if it was utilized in the way that I'm thinking, it would ease a lot of my criticisms with more modern survival horror games. I think a lot of more modern survival horror games, or games that claim that they are, especially in the AAA space, have removed a lot of the puzzle box design, which is something that I think deserves its place in the genre, and I know I wasn't going to talk about this, but here I am anyway, and they have since focused on giving you puzzle rooms, so to say, where you're more or less led along a straightforward path with an occasional hiccup of a simplified puzzle box, but condensed into a segment of the map, such as many of Silent Hill F's locations, or even the Otherworld Hospital in the Silent Hill 2 remake. If you took the soul tendency system and put it in a survival horror setting, you could still utilize the more straightforward design that a lot of modern horror games have been using, but in those more straightforward segments, you could utilize the variations that death would still provide to you. Imagine a segment between a save room whose entire purpose is to give you the punishment for your poor soul tendency. Maybe there's an unavoidable death that isn't available to someone who has been skating by the game well enough, or maybe there's a pool of health supplies. The thought of the Eternal Darkness sanity system being reworked and re-implemented under the threat of death would give this frustrating system that has always been tedious at worst, and only briefly effective at best, an entirely new breath of fresh air. And that is something that death desperately needs in survival horror. Love your face, love your show. Thank you for watching. Hey everyone, I don't normally do end cards like this, but I figured because this video is so different than what I normally do, it would be at least probably a good idea to do one. I hope you liked the video. This is something very different than what I normally tend to do. If you liked it, let me know in the comments. If you didn't, let me know. I have another idea for a topic that I could do in this same sort of format. So if you want to see more like this from me, let me know. I have one already planned. If not, I can work something up for Christmas. I'll catch you all later. And like I said, love your face, love your show.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.